Well, a very good afternoon to you if you are joining us, wherever you may be sat in the country. Welcome along to this joint CLA NFU webinar, which is all about managing public access and livestock and how to minimise the risks. And I hope you find it a really useful session. We've got a fantastic team of panelists to present and also to answer your questions this afternoon. Firstly, a few housekeeping things. For those of you who are attendees, your microphones are muted and your video is off. You won't be able to turn them on. Questions, really important that we hear from you guys. If you do have questions, please submit them via the Q&A panel only. So on your list of little buttons at the bottom, there's one that says Q&A. And if you have a question, please do submit it using the Q&A button. And please put who you are and where you're from, because it's great to get an idea. We've got people joining us from all over the country this afternoon, as well as CLA and NFU members. We also have members of the TFA, the Tenant Farmers Association, and the Countryside Alliance. So welcome one and all. My name is Hugh Broom. I've been asked to chair this afternoon's event. I am a Surrey farmer for my sins, nestled between a town and a village. With 300 acres and probably about 100 to 150 regular daily dog walkers use our farm and its 6 kilometres of footpaths every day. We have cattle and sheep on the farm, so I'm no stranger to the joy that is trying to manage rights of way and the general public and try and run a farm business to produce some food and pay the bills. We have our panellists, 5 of our panellists are going to give presentations. And I'm going to begin to introduce those in a minute. And then when we've heard from those guys, we'll introduce our 3 other panelists, and then we will start the questions and answer session. This session is being recorded. So please, if you do have to dash off, don't worry, you can catch up, you can rewind it. The link to the recording will be available through your various membership networks. I'm sure it'll be emailed out once we finish the session, but our aim is to be done and dusted by around about 3:30. So without further ado, a quick rundown of who our panelists are this afternoon. We have Stuart Roberts, who's from the National Farmers Union, Deputy President of the NFU. Dr. Stephen Britton, who's from the Health and Safety Executive. Mark Tufnell, Deputy President of the CLA. Claire Horton joins us from DEFRA. She's the Head of Access at DEFRA. Graham Rustling is a Rights of Way Manager from Kent County Council. And then joining us for the Q&A later on, once we've had the presentations, is James Legg, who's the Head of Political at the Countryside Alliance. Robert Martin, who's the Vice Chair of the Tenant Farmers Association, and Stephen Jenkinson, who's an Access and Countryside Advisor to the Kennel Club, and has for the last 25 years, or about 25 years, been working on the whole issue around access, farmland, dogs, and how best to manage it. So our presenting panelists will each be presenting a theme. So our first presentation is from Stuart Roberts, who's Deputy President of the National Farmers Union. And Stuart is going to talk to us about best practice, how to manage rights of way from the perspective of land management and farming. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Hugh, and it's a genuine pleasure to be at this event this afternoon. I think we've got already about 400 people on the call, which is fantastic. And I think also, as Hugh said at the beginning, this is a real collaboration of organisations. It's very much an area where lots and lots of organisations share very similar views. And like you, I am a farmer on the urban fringe. I farm just on the outskirts of Harpenden in Hertfordshire, 300 acres. I've got cattle and sheep as well. And I've got to say, Hugh mentioned the word joy with a degree of cynicism in some ways. And actually, one of the greatest pleasures I take is actually seeing people walking through my farm. It's also one of the biggest fears I have, and it is certainly one of the few things that keeps me awake at night sometimes. And just to put this in context, over the last year, we have seen a huge increase in people using our footpaths at Hammond's End here. Normally, they're pretty well used paths, but certainly on at least 2 bank holiday weekends last year, I had over 3,000 people walking through my farm. I've now just got to figure out how I turn that into a revenue stream, and I'll be well away. But what I see is 3,000 people for whom they are enjoying the landscapes we create. They are enjoying understanding where their food comes from, and that's a real positive. But it's also 3,000 people, every single one of whom is potentially a risk when it comes to particularly my livestock, and particularly my cattle, which is where I have the most concerns, and that's where I do occasionally wake up in the middle of the night. And I don't mind admitting there are years when I get to November, I bring the cattle in and I breathe a huge sigh of relief. The cattle and the walkers will not come confront each other again for a number of months. That wasn't until, of course, I put up a new cattle yard where I have no choice as to where it's located. It has to be alongside another public right of way. But actually, I feel much safer. Indeed, the biggest problem I've got there is trying to figure out how much to charge members of the public for taking photographs of my stunning looking Hereford cattle. But I do genuinely enjoy seeing the public using our rights of way, predominantly responsibly. Occasionally not responsibly, and I want to touch on some of that today. But I also want to take the theme, the title of this event, which is how to minimise risk. Because let's all be very honest here, as with most things in life, you can never eliminate risk. And many speakers will touch on the importance of risk assessments, I suspect, of the importance of managing risk. But ultimately, it is about minimizing it. Often you can't eliminate it. And I was asked to touch on some very practical points. So look, I make no apologies. I'm speaking here as a farmer, and I will speak about some of the things I've done on my own farm in Hertfordshire. And I've broken it down into a number of different categories, and I'll just go through some of those. So the first one is how I manage my animals. So I've got sheep, I've got cattle. The biggest worry I have is always with the cattle. It's a Hereford suckler herd. Often there will be a bull in with the cows, and this is where I have most of my concerns. And the first thing I always try and do is actually get to know our animals. So the first thing any of us should do is we should assess our animals. We should look carefully at animals' temperaments. Certainly, I've got a new bull arriving on the farm in a week or 10 days' time. He will be going nowhere near any fields that have public rights of way until I have become properly acclimatized myself with what his temperament's like. And wherever possible, I do try to move livestock away from fields with rights of way. It's not always possible. My biggest block of grazing has a right of way that goes diagonally across it. It wouldn't be impossible to remove livestock from that area, but it would have a huge disruption in terms of my business. So if I can remove the livestock from where they are, I will. But I can't always do that, and often I will have livestock in the field. The next point for me is looking at those aggressive animals. Now, we all at times will like to admit we don't have them, but I'm sure we have all come across that animal that we ourselves are very cautious of, very wary of, that is arguably potentially dangerous. We know that. I was on a farm many years ago where there was an animal, a cow, who you knew you did not get in a pen with that animal by yourself. And this is a slightly difficult one, because if we have an animal that is potentially dangerous, that is potentially aggressive, we have a responsibility to the public, to ourselves, and to others, to not put that animal in an area where it increases risks. Now, lots of people in the past I've spoken to will just remove that animal from a particular field or from a particular situation. I do think there are often occasions where it is worth considering removing that animal from your herd. Indeed, this can be uncomfortable. People talk about long lines of genetics. The reality is, though, where you have an aggressive animal, please have a little think about it. It may well be the most sensible thing to do with that animal is actually to have it culled. Now, in the past, I've heard of people who say, oh, well, actually, I'll just get it out of my herd. I'll throw it into the auction ring. I'll sell it to another farmer. I just think that is not on. If we know an animal presents a risk, then please consider whether that animal should be on any farm, anywhere. Regardless of rights of way, we're also putting ourselves potentially at risk. The next area I want to touch on is gates and fencing. And it is important that we have suitable gates and fencing. It's something I've spent a lot of time on here at Hammond's End. Well, correction, my guys have spent a lot of time on fences and gates. One of the things that we must remember, I didn't actually know this until I started looking a bit more into the topic. If you've got a bull in a field, make sure your fence is at least 1.3 meters high. Remember that one, 1.3 meters high. The other thing I've done on my farm is I've installed on all of our gates, and certainly gates that the public have access to, and kissing gates, we've got many of those, is to put those spring-mounted shutters. We all know the Countryside Code tells you to leave a gate as you found it, but the reality is people don't always do that. So make sure there's a strong spring there, then the gate will shut by itself. We don't have to worry about whether someone's going to leave it open. A couple of other areas I want to touch on, and I'll be fairly brief because we're on a fairly quick timeline today. The first one is signage. I've slightly struggled with signage over the years. I was certainly the owner at one stage of one of those big yellow and black triangular signs, I think they were at the time, that simply said, beware of the bull. We need to think very carefully about signs. It's actually not appropriate to have a sign that indicates that there is a risk there, or something that says, crossing this field, you do so at your own risk. That will have limited effect. But please do put up notices that inform people if there are animals in a field. Inform them that there is another right of way. A classic sign that I've got on one of my fields is there's a bull in this field. The right of way is open to the public, but you're welcome to use a permissive path marked by the blue arrows, something I myself have put in place. If you'd prefer to use that route, then please do so. It's also really useful to remember that we can't put signs in place that deter or attempt to deter people from using a footpath. So going forward, make sure we remember the footpath remains open. Permissive paths are something that's really, really important on my farm. I've used lots and lots of them, and people want to use permissive paths. Make sure they're signposted correctly, make sure you lay them out correctly, and you can really start to reduce that risk. As I say, you can never eliminate risk, but what you can do through looking at your stock, by assessing your stock, by looking at signage, by having the right infrastructure in place, whether that be gates or fencing, you can actually start to minimize that risk. And one of the things, the very last point from me, I've had a thought this next year as to what I'm going to do. I've got one field, I say, it's got this path goes diagonally through it that I worry about. So actually, I've applied to the Countryside Productivity Grant Scheme. I've got a solar-powered energizer. I've got an electric fence, which will be some distance away from the footpath. So I minimize the risk of walkers and the electric fence, but it'll keep distance between my cattle and those walkers. Really simple thing, really simple, may not be appropriate for everyone, but something I'm doing on my farm to help minimize the risk as well as the signage. But let's also remember, all those people who are out in the countryside are enjoying the landscapes we create, understanding where their food comes from, and we should celebrate that, but make sure we all do it in a responsible way, both the farmer and the walker.
Stuart, thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Britton, who works for the Health and Safety Executive. He has done for over 20 years. A stark reminder, I think, of this issue from the walker perspective for me was when I was looking at the health and safety figures for 2019-20, and they're broken down. If you look at the health and safety report to agriculture every year, they're broken down into regional figures. And where I am in Surrey, in the southeast, 2019-20, unfortunately, there were 4 farm deaths in the southeast region. The real tragedy is that 3 of those 4, they're all tragic, but 3 of those 4 were members of the public who were killed by livestock whilst out walking, which I just find it a really stark figure. Stephen, over to you. You're going to talk to us about how you see things from a health and safety perspective, but also about sheet 17, which is a piece of paper that I'm told we should all become very accustomed to. Stephen Britton.
All right, Fab, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite. I think we've been led in very well there by our NFU colleague into the things you can do. So livestock incidents account for about 5 deaths each year. 50 incidents are reported to HSE. I don't think a lot of people know HSE have an involvement in agriculture, so I think a lot of it ends up with the sort of rights of way officers and that sort of stuff, and they fall into 2 categories. So there's the cattle handling incidents, the classic incident involving somebody being knocked down, and then the other ones are the where walkers are injured by cows, and often when they're with calves. So going to the 2019 figures, as you mentioned, a dog was present in 18 of the 43 incidents reported, so nearly half. Of the 43 incidents, 23 of them involved cows with young calves, so nearly half. We've never been able to discern that there's any particular trend in terms of the type of animal. So the problem that we've got is, as you know, the members of the public are entitled to use the right of way, and they may have no idea about the countryside, and there may be vulnerable people amongst them. So you can't expect them to know around animal behavior necessarily. You need to consider the amount and type of public access. So as mentioned in the previous talk, a public right of way with limited use in it is very different to having a large thoroughfare that's a walker's route that's going to be a sort of coast to coast type thing, which is always well used, like Hadrian's Wall or one of those kind of areas. Consider bulls. Dairy bulls have been banned from public rights of way for a long time, and most farmers will know that. Beef or mixed bulls are okay as long as they're accompanied by their cows or heifers. So if they get out and then they're onto an area with a public right of way without the herd, that's an offence in and of itself. So you've got to give more consideration to bulls because they're obviously larger and more strong. And give greater thought to segregation, particularly at busier times. So think about the school holidays, February half term, Easter's coming up, the May bank holidays. That's the times when the public will be out in force. Segregate where possible, permanent fencing where you can, temporary fencing as appropriate, electrified fencing with signage on it to warn people that it's electrified. Plan the location of handling and feeding away from public rights of way where you can. Here's an example of some sort of minimal segregation with a little bit of an electric fence. And then a more permanent sort of piece where the cattle can be moved across and divided up and make sure they can't get up the right of way. So the right of way goes along here, and we've got a nice path that's been put in there to allow the cattle to be moved around as well. Temporary diversions can be provided as described earlier, but you have to bear in mind that some people will want to follow the right of way, and you have to assume that some people will do that. So here's an example of that in practice. So here we see somebody's put a temporary diversion in place. Open access land, you can't restrict people's use, but you can think about your cattle segregation and put some signage up, which I'll come to later, to warn people about when there's likely to be cows and calves. So here's an example can be downloaded from the Scottish Government's website, which gives an idea of when people should be aware that there may be cows and young calves, and therefore take a little bit more extra precaution. Be aware of the temperament, as we discussed earlier. And then coming on to the signage, The standard signing is a yellow and black sign and just warning cattle in field, bull in field, not warning that there's any danger, as alluded to earlier. So this sort of stuff, unless you're Usain Bolt, don't use my field, is probably best avoided. If you put up some kind of danger or warning, you're basically saying you know that there's a hazard you haven't addressed. You may as well just sign the solicitor's fees now. This sort of thing, your dog could be shot or found amongst the sheep. Really not a great idea. Bull signs, supplementary text, bull in field, avoid words such as beware or danger. Be aware that there may be people whose English isn't a first language. There may be people on holiday, that sort of stuff. So just signage with a little pictogram is better than. And there are ones for cows with calves in fields. Those are commercially available. HSE doesn't have any involvement in those, but there are plenty of signage companies out there that make good quality things that you can use. So the civil law around this stuff is that essentially you're responsible for your cattle, and if you know that they can act aggressively if they can become stressed. You've got duties under the Occupiers Liability Act and the Animals Act 1971. So animals that can either be an inherently dangerous species or one that we know can become aggressive when threatened. So this is a good example with the cattle with calves, that we know that there's an elevated risk there that we need to focus in on, particularly first time heifers, and the liability that therefore comes with that. So HSE uses a thing called the enforcement management model, and what we would do is compare the risk of serious personal injury against the conditions found at the time of the incident. So bear in mind, as a landowner, HSE will recover its costs for all investigations and so on. So there was a case some years ago involving Mr. Mike and Mr. John Porter, who were traveling across a field and they were attacked by the cows. The incident was the fourth in 5 years involving injuries to members of the public on this landowner's land. One of the brothers was really badly injured, sort of life-changing type injuries, and the other brother tragically died. And this was a breach of the Health and Safety at Work Act, Section 3, and was given a 12-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years in order to pay costs of £30,000. Now, since 2016, the sentencing guidelines have been introduced, and there's far higher fines for health and safety because they weren't considered to be enough punishment for these kinds of things. So following through the sentencing guidelines, the harm category would be one, as in death would quite readily occur. We would look at aggravating features in that had there been previous advice concerned, and then a typical farm will be a micro business in terms of the lookup tables. So the with a turnover of up to £2 million, and depending on how culpable somebody is, you can see that the starting range for fines is £30,000, £100,000, £160,000, or £250,000, with aggravating features running up to £500,000. And the costs awarded by a court don't include the fee for intervention costs. So if you imagine that HSE may interview people and take statements, that will all be charged out at our standard charge out rate, which is about £150 an hour. So there would be likely £50,000 worth of charge out for a large investigation on top of that figure. So that brings into stark perspective the what you consider reasonably practicable when you're going to put fencing and so on in place. If you've got these kinds of fines, that would buy you a lot of precautions up front. So to sum up, we've talked about public rights of way and a little about open access. I realise I've talked very fast, but this presentation will be available to you afterwards as well. The guidance that is available, there's AIS 17 for England and Wales, and then there's a slightly different version for Scotland because of the open access areas there. And we also consider the Countryside Landowners Association guidance, which is very good, to be relevant good practice also. There's plenty of other bits of guidance from Farmers Weekly, the Countryside Code, which I know we're going to talk a little bit about later, the DEFRA presentation. The PDSA and other agencies have produced some guidance for both for landowners and for walkers. And that's me done.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was really useful. As mentioned there, this is obviously being recorded, so you can spool back through and see that presentation, or that presentation will also be shared, as will the links as to where you can find those information sheets for Scotland and for England and Wales. So our next presentation, welcome if you have just joined us. Just a quick reminder, if you have questions, please put them on the Q&A panel, not the chat panel. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a little button with speech bubbles, 2 speech bubbles that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can put the question through there. Please don't put it through the chat channel. So our next speaker is Mark Tufnell. Mark is the Deputy President of the CLA. And Mark is going to talk to us about a recent CLA proposal, which is being floated with government at the moment, on what might make things slightly easier when it comes to moving footpaths. Mark.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and a very warm welcome to everybody this afternoon. You've heard about the dramas and the dangers that there are, and to try to come forward with a solution to government, I wrote with Stuart Roberts from the NFU, Tim Bonner from the Countryside Alliance, and Robert Martin from the Tenant Farmers Association. We wrote to Lord Gardner back in October about a proposal to have a temporary diversion of public right-of-way across a field when there's livestock present in the field. And it would only be for a short period of time, it would only be for 40 days, and you'd have to put up a notice at either end of the pathway. And I'll just take you back, really, a tiny bit of history as to why on earth we have all these public rights of way and the logic of where they go from A to B. We had the war, and then after the war there was a big consultation. They came up with the definitive map, and they brought together all those drovers' routes, all the routes that people used to take when they walked to work, all the routes that people used to take when they walked to church, and it was all brought together, and it came up with the rights of way. So a lot of these routes that are there historically, probably there for reasons that don't really exist anymore, but they're now enjoyed by the general public, quite rightly, and it's good that the public are able to come out and enjoy the countryside. But we have to remember it is a living and working countryside. So we have to somehow address this problem, and this year's been particularly bad, as been highlighted earlier, and we've seen 4 very dramatic fatalities as a result of walking. And in so many cases, a simple diversion across a field would work extremely well. And if I could just have the first slide up, I can just try and explain why. Hopefully the slides will appear. Now, the letter went through to Lord Gardner on the 6th of October, as I said. He replied to us on the 19th of November, thanking us for our letter, acknowledging the importance of people's health and well-being and support for the local economy, fully recognising that it is a living and working countryside. And I put before you the proposal that we put to him. We have here a footpath going from A to B, or B to A, whichever you would like to look at it. And if we were going to put cattle in there, livestock, and actually in the definition of livestock, we specifically excluded sheep because we didn't feel that sheep were a danger to the general public. It's mainly cattle and cows at calves, with calves at foot, that are a main risk. And we just said if we had a notice put up at point B and at point A, giving the intention to divert the footpath, For instance, in the second slide, I can just show you from B to C to A. You'll see on the inside of the field, around the edge, if one wanted to do that, we have a notice at point C. Or if we decided that we didn't, well, the farmer decided he didn't want to have anybody walking across the field, you'll see in the next slide, the final slide, you can go from B to E to D and back to A. So not that much of a detour, and it would only be there for 40 days, and then it would revert. That would be long enough for the cows to eat the grass in the field. And it would be like for like. So if at point B, there's a gate, then you wouldn't be allowed to have a stile, for example, at point E or D, because you wouldn't be able to get through if you were in a wheelchair. So we don't have like for like access to divert a footpath around a field. Now, there was a pilot, well, has been a pilot down in Cornwall, and this has been tried and it's worked very well. And we've done it alongside the Ramblers and other user groups. And the argument has always been, and the argument has come back from Lord Gardner, who's largely rejected our requests for an amendment to the Highways Act through lack of parliamentary time. He said in effect that there's you could use the route across the field as well. Now, the issue that we have is that it would be a permissive route, even if you diverted it all the way around, unless it's there within the Highways Act. If anybody walks across the field down the original route, which they would be entitled to do, then the liability for that would still remain with the farmer and the landowner. And we think that that's unreasonable if reasonable precautions have been taken in order to divert the footpath, as I've shown, from A to D to E, back to A. So we have had, though, I must say, slightly more success in Wales. There's an access reform advisory group, and the CLA are part of that. Sophie Dwerrihouse, our access advisor, and Charles de Winton, our surveyor in the Welsh team, are part of that group. And we've been having constructive discussions with the minister responsible in the Welsh government, Leslie Griffiths, and we're hopeful that a diversion along the lines that I've suggested may be enacted in Wales, because of course we do have devolution, and our letter to Lord Gardner is really only in relation to England. So I hope I've explained to you why our associations have written to Lord Gardner, the proposal we've put to him for a solution which we think would work. It would only be temporary. It would get around a lot of the difficulties around the historic routes of footpaths that are not particularly relevant in the modern working environment, and which we feel will be an answer to the problems that we're hearing about, and would significantly reduce the number of fatalities that have occurred in the past. So I look forward to the panel discussion, and I shall hand back to Hugh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation there. Just a couple of points. David and Caroline Gill point out on the Q&A that, of course, sheep, potentially rams, can be an issue. It's not just about cows and calves. Equally, obviously, the other way around, sheep can also be worried. Good to hear movement on the diversion rules, particularly from the devolved point of view. If Wales does that, it's very interesting and hopefully encouraging for those of us managing land in England. Similarly, of course, we've got the sheep worrying legislation, which the one of the MSP from Stranraer is trying to push through the Scottish Parliament at the moment, which would seriously up the penalties for dog owners if their dogs are caught worrying or killing sheep. Right, we move on to the next presentation, which is from Claire Horton, and Claire is the head of access at DEFRA. And so she's going to give us an update on what's going on at the moment, including, of course, Claire, your current big consultation on the countryside code. Claire, over to you.
Hello, yeah, that's fine. Thanks very much. So I'm Claire Horton, Head of Access at DEFRA. It's really nice to be here today and really interesting presentations so far. Just putting my slideshow on. Are you able to see that?
Yeah, it's looking good.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So our objective for access is that it benefits as many people as possible. So benefiting the public, but also very much, of course, the local community, the people that are living and working in the countryside, and working well for the land managers who are hosting the access, the rights of way going across their land. Access brings us so many benefits, improving health and well-being, benefiting local businesses and economies, joining up the local communities, providing opportunities for access travel, and we do want as many people as possible to benefit from that. Since the start of the pandemic in the last year, of course, we've seen huge changes, massive increases in the number of people walking in the countryside. And this is, of course, something really positive that we've wanted to see for a while. And we expect that will lead to increased understanding of the countryside and ultimately increased respect for the countryside and better behaviour. So we have seen that recent surveys have shown 53% of people saying they appreciate their local green spaces more, 63% said protecting and enhancing it should be a higher priority. So we're already seeing that increased respect and the benefits that it's bringing, but it is also bringing a large number of challenges. We've got new audiences that aren't as familiar with the countryside, and just the pure numbers as well, of course, is becoming more difficult to deal with. Some of the issues that have been reported over the last year, such as litter, for example, parking and so on. So one of the main vehicles that we've got to educate the public, to get these messages across, is the Countryside Code, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. The code, of course, provides advice for the public on their responsibilities while enjoying the countryside. And there's a short version, of which there was a COVID specific version released last year. There's a long, more detailed version, and there's a version aimed at land managers as well. So in the last year, it's been promoted in lots of different ways, targeting new audiences, targeting younger people in particular, trying to get it across to people that might not have necessarily seen or been familiar with the traditional code. So social media, digital billboards, adverts on Snapchat, which successfully reach really large audiences. And this is just a couple of screenshots from some of the examples of the videos that have been shared on social media, with messages such as parking, keeping to footpaths, also messages such as avoiding littering, keeping dogs under control, and so on. So the classic messages that come up time and time again, that the messages that most people seem to agree is what we want the public to hear. So as you may well know, Natural England are currently refreshing and relaunching the Countryside Code. They've been working with stakeholders at the moment on the advice for the public, which is planned to be relaunched in time for Easter, because of course we do expect quite a lot of increase of numbers around Easter, which people are planning for. So in terms of that consultation with stakeholders, at the bottom, I've got a table here with some of the main issues that have been raised by the key stakeholder groups. And as you can see, dogs under control are very much up there. There's the top or near the top for everyone, with some of the issues which relate to access livestock, such as gates as well, following paths, which have been raised before. So these are all very much some of the issues that are going to be included in the code. Later in the year, the advice for land managers is also going to be relaunched as well, which will complement and link to the sheet 17 as well that Stephen mentioned, with HSE's more detailed advice on that. In addition to the Countryside Code, some of our other major work streams at DEFRA that should offer some elements that can be of help to land managers who are trying to manage the risk of livestock and access. So environmental land management, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar with. The new scheme will support farmers to deliver public goods, make a significant contribution to the environment. And it's got three components: the Sustainable Farming Initiative, aimed at all farmers to be able to enter into, local nature recovery, looking at local priorities for environmental protection, and then landscape recovery, looking at changes across a whole landscape scale. So one of the public goods the ELM will be able to support is enhanced beauty, heritage and engagement with the environment. And access is a key part of that as one of the main ways that the public can engage with the environment. So this is all the type of actions that can be funded through ELM, is very much in development at the moment, but some of the actions that we're looking at in relation to access are things to create and enhance the access network, such as creating new paths, improving existing paths, but also very much things to address some of the issues that access can raise to reduce some of the impact. For example, fencing, signage, could be some of the potential things that could be included. And in terms of engagement as well, promoting positive behaviour and messages, educating people through, for example, school trips, promoting the countryside code. It could be a range of different things to really just try and increase the understanding of the public of the countryside and the respect that people have for it. And then finally, just mentioning rights of way reform, which is a programme of legislation that we're hoping to pass by the end of this year. Now, we've already heard about the definitive map, which is the legal record of rights of way, which is at the moment still quite incomplete. It does cause problems for people when historic rights of way can come to light, which haven't necessarily been known before. So this project will address this. It will streamline the processes that local authorities use to record and change rights of way. So a deadline will be brought into force for recording these historic rights of way that are not currently recorded, and that will finalise the definitive map, the legal record, so that walkers and landowners have certainty about where these rights of way exist. And probably more importantly, for the particular issue of managing issues around livestock and access, it will include an application process which landowners can use to apply to local authorities to divert rights of way on their land. The decision will be very much down to local authorities based on the public interest to look at and decide on a case-by-case basis. But there are specific situations where, for example, paths cross dangerous farmyards, where we believe that it's not always appropriate to have a footpath, for example, going through private gardens as well. And in this case, diversion may be the best option. Again, it's very much for local authorities to decide on a case-by-case basis, looking at the specific situation, the local needs, the public interest, and so on. But those are a couple of the different work streams that we're working on at DEFRA, which should help land managers who are seeking to manage any risks relating to livestock and access.
Thank you very much, Claire, for that. It's very interesting and a lot of work going on there, and some really tricky work as well when it comes to someone that's we actually diverted a footpath out of a farmyard, and the bonus was we turned it into a cycleway for all the users. But despite there being a clear benefit, the whole thing then got dragged through a public inquiry. So I'm quite familiar with the joy that is rights of way legislation. Our final presentation, firstly, also thank you very much for all the questions coming in on the Q&A panel. Please do keep adding them there. I know some of our panelists are actually answering some of those on there as they're coming in as well, and then some will bring into the wider debate. Our final presentation, we go to Kent. And we join Graham Rustling, who is the Rights of Way Manager for Kent County Council, and Graham is going to give us the lowdown, as it were, from the coalface in across rural Kent. Graham.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of talking to you today. I should say that for the last 31 years, I've been working in the field of public rights of way and access. Prior to which I spent 6 years studying and then working in agriculture, principally breaking things and generally adding to the wrong side of the balance sheet. If I could provide a little bit of context that I think's probably been missing so far, and that's to say, England and Wales, we've got a 190,000 kilometre or 119,000 thereabouts mile network of rights of way, various statuses, footpaths, bridleways, restricted byways and byways open to all traffic, on top of which I think it's England only 865,000 hectares of access land on which there's access on foot for the purposes of open air recreation, and sometimes on hoof as well. And I'd like to Really start now by echoing some of Stuart's positive opening remarks. I mean, when you talk about 190,000 kilometres of rights of way, that is a very large shop window to show the public what you do and how you go about it. Rather unlike the shop window on the high street, though, in this case, the high street tends to go around the back of the shop as well, and sometimes prods into bits of places you wouldn't really like the public to see. But nonetheless, it's a huge shop window for what you do. You should see that in a positive, and to take real positives from seeing the public out there and using it. Economically, hugely valuable. I think 20 billion is a value put on open air visits to the countryside each year by Natural England. And there's a downside, I suppose, in terms of value as well, in terms of if you look at obesity, inactivity in Kent, estimated cost to Kent alone, 306 million. So we can get people out walking, riding, cycling. It all helps to reduce the burden on the public purse. And on that basis, it's no wonder that governments of every persuasion over 50, 60 years have all legislated to provide greater access and to further protect rights. Most recently to provide the England Coast Path. It'll come as no surprise at all to find that Wales completed theirs some time ago. I would argue because they had a French referee, but I will get over that at some point. You got, now speaking specifically in terms of access and livestock, what we're really looking at today in management of risk is managing that interaction, that interface between the public and livestock. And when we look at that, we've already heard of about 5 fatalities a year on average, 50 injuries. They're all tragic events, but we've got to put that in the context of 1.4 billion visits to the countryside or thereabouts. So actually, incidents are relatively uncommon, but consequences are very serious. And I went back through the last 5 years reports in Kent, and I think we've had 142 reports in Kent of incidents or nuisance reported involving animals, 45 of which related to bulls. And actually, when I went through them, 45 of which related to bulls that were all lawful, or indeed many not even bulls. And there we have some of the issue. What the public may look at and consider to be a bull may well not be a bull. There's a very famous one in Kent that was missing 2 key ingredients for any bull, but it was reported time and again, just because it was definitely formerly a male animal and it was the size of a house, so everyone assumed it was a bull. So what can we do in a practical sense? Well, first of all, where is the access? If you're a landowner, land manager, I'd say it's incumbent on you to know where actually the access is on the farm. And that doesn't necessarily just mean where people walk or ride. You need to go back. You get generally the definitive map and statement is available on local authority websites. Certainly shire counties and unitary authorities. Find out where the rights of way are and the access land maps, and then add in any other access that you're aware of. And today, it naturally, because we're looking at risk, it tends to focus around cattle, but I'm pleased sheep have had a mention. I'd also like to give a big mention to horses. We're as likely to get reports about horses being a nuisance or unsettling people when they use rights of way, if I can put it that way. Particularly other equestrians. If you're keeping horses in a field crossed by a bridleway, you've got that interaction between horses then, as well as potential disease transmission and whatever else. I should say at this point, the past year hasn't been representative. We have counters on the network in a few areas that are showing 2 to 4 times the use. We heard from Stuart early on, 3,000 users in a day on his farm in Hertfordshire. Incredible numbers we're seeing. So I think we've got to step back a year probably to get a more realistic picture ongoing. But I think it's reasonable to expect that the sort of issues we'll have seen more this year, inadvertent trespass, unthinking trespass, as opposed to inadvertent, just not aware, and activities, in unthinking activities. The number of times I've been out in and around my local area to find people kicking footballs around in fields as they've gone along on a walk during these times of lockdown, I wouldn't care to count. And I think it's reasonable to expect going forward that not all these newfound users will suddenly revert to a day out at Blue Water or shopping or whatever else it may be as soon as all the restrictions are lifted. Many, now having discovered rights of way in their area, will continue to use those rights of way. So what can we do? Firstly, clearly marked paths. Navigation is all. The number of people in this day and age can't read maps, don't carry maps, and are entirely reliant on their phones, the phone taking over the function of a brain and common sense. Well, actually, one of the ways in which you can help these people is just clearly mark the paths. Not only on entrance to a field should be clearly waymarked, but can you see the exit point? I have to say, when I walk my dog, if I'm walking through a field with cattle, and I'm familiar with cattle, I'm comfortable with cattle, I still make sure I can see the route out the other side. I actually want to be in that field for the shortest possible time. Just reduce that interaction. So signposting, waymarking. Maintenance of routes. We've seen a lot of path creep through lockdown, where we've had inordinate levels of use and paths have spread wider and wider. And I've seen one or two despairing emails, and I've got a great deal of sympathy with it. But maintenance. So maintenance by the highway authority, responsible for the surface of the route. Maintenance of the path furniture, particularly stiles and gates, where they're the landowner responsibility, but you may claim up to 25% of your costs to maintain. And in most authorities, we'll deal with that by way of offering gates, for instance, or the materials, or gates with a reduced at a reduced cost. So in Kent, we ask for a contribution towards the cost of a gate, and we provide it. So definitely gates, stiles, and please, when you're looking at them, there are British standards for gates and stiles. But the thing I always say about gates, if it's an equestrian trying to use it, they need manoeuvring space. They need to be able to get at the gate furniture to open and close it. You know, you don't want it. It should be opened and openable by I like to say a sprightly pensioner. It shouldn't be a gate that can only be opened by a hardened agricultural worker or Precious Mackenzie, for anyone who goes back that far. Yeah, they've got to be easy to open. We've had a lot from Health and Safety Executive, and I think it's right. Considered, I'd wrap this up as considered grazing and considerate grazing. So it's about the temperament of your stock. It's about those routes that are most used, trying to avoid those areas at times, weekends, when there's the greatest deal of use. And compliant grazing as well. We know we can't graze bulls that are other than beef bulls over the age of 10 months. And then they must be accompanied by cows and heifers. A bit about segregation. Temporary fencing. I used to spend many a happy hour erecting temporary fencing with strict grazing cattle and stuff. Carefully thought out temporary fencing to keep the public on the right of way and out of the adjacent land is one way you may go about it. Fencing on a more permanent basis to keep stock in and people out. That's historically what happened. That's what most of the boundaries are around for. Potentially expensive. Got to be thought through, and I'd ask that you always liaise with the highway authority if you're going to do so, because most rights of way will be wider than I imagine you think. And don't forget, fencing's to be 1.3 meters high, as we heard earlier, as a minimum. Alternative routes. Thought that was a good way of going about it. An opportunity to provide an alternative, but it must be an alternative. The definitive route, the public highway, must be available for use, even if you're providing an alternative. And if you're going to start providing alternatives, I'd suggest you take advice and submit a statutory declaration and deposit to the surveying authority to protect yourself from rights being acquired through use, unchallenged use. Advisory signs and notices, we've heard a bit about this. Again, don't be tempted to make your own. There are very good signs out there. The NFU provide guidance on them, CLBA likewise, highway authorities will. There's a very good NFU and Kennel Club sign, particularly for areas where there's dog walking, that provides clear information, sets out clearly what's expected in the way of behaviour, and get about the right tone. Gets about the right tone. You know, what you mustn't do is put up signs that in any way seek to deter the public, provide false or misleading notices. It's an offence you can be prosecuted for, to actually seek to deter the public with a false or misleading sign. And if you are tempted to put up bull in field signs, remove them when the bull is no longer in the field, please. And one final point, we've heard about the Countryside Code, so I'll skip over that. But diversion or extinguishment, I am on something of a different page to Mark, I've got to say, on this, and I'll express a personal view because it's never been before Kent County Council, so I can't claim it's the view of the council. But it seems to me a system of temporary diversions will reduce certainty for the public. There's no guarantee around sign standards, and there's a cumulative impact. I looked at Mark's diagram, and I thought, that's great. What if the next door neighbour's done similar, and the one after's done similar, and you've turned my 1 mile walk into a 3 mile walk? Not overly convinced. And I have to say, there is a parallel under the Road Traffic Regulation Act for temporary closure, and under that act, where we're closing for works, utilities companies and the like, there's a very heavily regulated process that we are involved in as the Highway Authority and the Traffic Authority, and there's a cost to that. So in Kent, you're looking at about £340 plus advertising for a short-term closure. Permanent diversions. We've already heard from Hugh, who's attempted to divert a footpath and upgrade it for cycle use, presumably through Cycle Tracks Act. I'd say permanent diversions, extinguishments, consider very, very carefully. All are taken on their individual merits. The process is lengthy. It's not cheap, about £2,500 in Kent. It's a power for the authority, not a duty. So we tend to have backlogs. And there is a well set out process that's seeking to draw a balance between landowner interest, convenience for the users, and the expediency, taking into account a broad raft of matters such as amenity, impact on the land, needs of agriculture. And I personally think we shouldn't be seeking to completely redraw a map that reflects historic use and connects to our history, but small tweaks may be appropriate. And with that, Hugh, I'd say, if you're going to go down that route, the least ambitious and most generous of the proposals do most. And with that, I just encourage everyone to engage positively with their local rights of way officers, because it's lovely to hear from you and for you to hear from us when we've not got an issue and we're starting with a point of conflict. Okay, thank you, Hugh.
Graham, thank you very much. I should just point out we were successful with the diversion and we created the cycleway, and it's massively increased the footfall through the farm. That's a good thing, and it comes with its challenges, and Surrey County Council, the highways guys, were phenomenal as well in doing that. It is bang on 3:30. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Stuart Roberts from the NFU, Dr. Stephen Britton from the HSE, the Health and Safety Inspectorate, Mark Tufnell, the Deputy President of the CLA, Claire Horton, who joined us today from Bristol, who is the Head of Access for DEFRA, Graham Russling from Kent County Council, Rights of Way Manager. Also, I'd like to thank James Legg, who's the Head of Political at the Countryside Alliance, Robert Martin, the Vice Chair of the Tenant Farmers Association, and Stephen Jenkinson, who joined us from he's an advisor to the Kennel Club, who joined us today. Also like to thank the staff at the CLA and the NFU for organising today's webinar. I think hopefully you found it really useful. I certainly have, just listening to the questions and the replies. Also, don't forget, this will be available to spool back. It's recorded, so you can go back through if you need to. Your various organisations, be that the NFU, the CLA, the TFA, or indeed the Countryside Alliance, will signpost you to where you can find the recording of today's webinar. But once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you very much to all those who've worked very hard to organise today. It's been a very useful afternoon. Go and enjoy the afternoon. It's beautiful sunshine here. We'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.